Yes. Perfect. Okay. So really quickly, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can all kind of look at those instructions and make sure that everybody's, again, aware of what we're talking about. So there's share screen. I need to do this. Share. Perfect. All right. Everybody seeing that? Cool. Perfect. And again, this is on Blackboard for you guys already, so it's not a huge new thing that we're looking at today. But really what I wanted to do with these instructions is just sort of make sure everyone's aware of what we're expecting for these projects. So this is called industry project, right? And what we're looking for with these final sort of capstone projects is the idea that you all can critically look at the industry as a whole. And when we say the industry, that is PR, advertising, marketing, communications, strategic comm, whatever, under that umbrella, right? Particularly those of you who are in the field already, sort of looking at your field or your particular industry critically, or for those of you who are planning on entering the field after graduation or who are looking to pivot into another industry potentially, looking at those particular areas critically as well. And what we're doing with this, it's not sort of academic research in the traditional sense, because I think academic research to some extent is self-serving, and it's a little bit sort of upper tier and inaccessible to the layperson that's being discussed in that research generally. And so what we're doing here is more of the applied research. But what we're doing is looking critically at whatever that industry is that you're either currently in or planning on entering. And finding a problem, right, or an issue that we have seen in that industry or that is sort of pervasive in that space, that we know is a problem, right? And so that could be any number of things depending on the industry that you're looking at, right? So he's in. So that could be any number of things. In PR, there are particular things that we look at. In advertising, there's particular issues. Marketing has its own issues. It really just kind of depends on the industry. But taking a critical look at those industries and noticing something wrong or something that could be addressed, right? And I've actually got examples that I'll post for you guys later this week so you can kind of see what other people have done in the past. But it really kind of depends on the industry. It depends on your perspective on the industry. It depends on, timing to some extent, right? So, but you guys need to be able to kind of critically look at those industries and find an issue, right? Once you've sort of found an issue or something that you want to look further into or want to pursue, what we're doing here is actually looking at ways to potentially address that issue, right? So defining the issue is one thing, but then actually being able to sort of look critically at the issue and figure out why that issue may exist or what has led to that issue, what has caused that issue within that particular industry, right? And so looking at these instructions here, that's sort of the context of the problem, this part one here. So finding the issue, the problem, or opportunity that you'll discuss, and importance of that related to the industry, right? So what we're doing there is actually, how did this come about, right? How did we get here? How did the industry get here? What were the key factors that led to this situation, right? Providing details here. And if we think about these three different sections here, context, background, and methodology, if you think about a traditional research paper, right, it's essentially follows the same structure: introduction, lit review, methodology, right? So if you've ever written any sort of research papers in any of your other classes that have followed that structure, it's very similar to that. We just sort of frame it a little bit differently from the sort of applied research perspective. But your first step is just sort of defining that problem and telling us how we got there, right? And again, depending on your interest, depending on the field, depending on the industry itself, that background situation may be vastly different, right? One thing that I want to point out for all of you is that your projects are all going to be very different. And you'll see in the examples that I'll post later this week, those examples are all vastly different and cover very different sort of problems and different industries and different aspects of those industries. So just because you're not doing something the same way someone else is, that's okay, right? So just keep that in mind. So part one of this, part one of your proposal is actually just sort of defining the problem, providing background on that problem, and giving us kind of a situation analysis of what it is, how we got here, where we currently stand. Okay, cool, straightforward. And that second part is where we get into a little bit more of the academic side. In my little discussion post that I wrote this weekend, I mentioned that this is not necessarily kind of an academic research project. It is more applied. However, what we're going to do in this section too, think of this as sort of your literature review. Again, in a traditional research paper, this is where you start discussing things like theories and models, and providing background information on what might be causing that issue or things that might affect or impact that issue. So what we say here is it says create an outline. We're not necessarily doing an outline, right? I'm in the traditional sense, I don't really care so much about that. But what we do need to do is once you've defined your problem in that first step, the second step here is where we're actually going to pull in some theory, right? Some sort of academic theory or academic models that have been researched and that exist in our field to maybe help explain that issue that you sort of laid out in number one, in part one. And so, for example, one student in the past was working for a municipal government, and he realized that within their organization, they had a hard time recruiting people for their summer positions, their sort of temporary summer positions, whether it was like a lifeguard at a local pool or counselors for programs they were offering, that kind of thing. And so he addressed that problem in his first part. He sort of laid out what that problem was. And then in the second part, we sort of talked and discussed different sort of theories or different models that we could look at that might help explain or improve those outcomes. And so, for example, for him in particular, we looked at things like message framing theory, right? What are we focusing on in these messages that we're relaying to these individuals, in these job postings? Is it the pay? Is it the benefits? Is it the hours? Is it, what aspect are we focusing on? Are we focusing on very sort of tangible things like pay, hours, that kind of thing? Or are we focusing on things like how fun this job is or how, the impact that this job has on the community, right? Those sort of intangibles, right? And which one of those might be more effective? How do we frame that message? And which one of those frames is more effective in recruitment, right? So that was a very theoretical based premise to potentially explain why or why not those job postings weren't as effective as they could be. Does that make sense? So we're kind of adding in some sort of theoretical background. And these are things that you probably discussed in courses like APR 550 and 51, the sort of preliminary courses where you go over theories and models really sort of at a preliminary level. And you'll notice also in our course module itself, those sort of background folders, those different modules will give you some of that as well. It'll be a review of theory and a review of research methods and that kind of thing. So look through those and that might give you more of an insight into that. But again, so what we're doing in that background info is providing some sort of synthesis of existing research, right, to support why that issue exists or what might be causing that issue, or maybe even things to potentially address the issue, right? From existing research. Okay, so that's kind of the heavy academic part of this project, is that part two, doing that lit review of that theory or of those different models or different theories plural, to potentially explain what's going on for that industry issue. So it is a weird mix of kind of applied and academic research, but what we're essentially doing is giving an academic edge to an applied project or an industry project, if that makes sense, right? And so from that literature review and from that sort of secondary research that you're going to do related to your issue and related to those theories and models, you're going to develop research questions, right? So for example, going back to the project that I talked about earlier related to the job postings, the research questions were essentially, what frame of reference is more impactful for these job postings, right? Is it the more practical pay, hours, benefits conversation? Or is it more of the sort of implied happiness or enjoyment or impact, that sort of more empathic, side of things, right? And so that was the research question that he developed based off the literature review and the research that he'd done, right? And depending on your project, you may have one research question, you may have up to 2 or 3, right? Research questions are kind of open-ended. They are based on the literature and based on research that already exists, but it's what we would like to know, right? A research question is nothing more than really what we want to know or what we're trying to find out, right, through this project. So, and again, when we have our one-on-one meetings, I'll help you sort of craft those a little bit more effectively too, to make sure that we're getting something that we can actually find. So just keep that in mind, but start sort of getting, as you research this stuff, start thinking about potential research questions and what we're actually looking for with this project. Okay. Have I lost anybody yet? Are we lost? Are we completely left field? Okay, cool. So then, and all we're really going to talk about today to get you started is this part 3 as well, so methodology. So again, if we're following that traditional research paper format, we've got our introduction in part 1, we've got our lit review in part 2 and research questions, and then part 3 is how we would potentially find, or how we would actually experiment to find those research questions. What method are we going to use to test those questions, or to test what we've sort of hypothesized, even though we're not making hypotheses, right? So let's say that we're going back to that same example of the municipal job postings, and we wanted to know which style of posting was more effective, right, for the people that we're looking for. So what that student did was essentially put together a 2x2 experiment, right? So he was putting out different ad treatments, and he was showing people treatments for the more tangible side, which again included the benefits and the pay. There were ad treatments for the more sort of implied benefits, so happiness, that kind of thing. Then he showed those to survey participants, and then they sort of rated their experience looking at one treatment versus the other, right? So that's essentially a survey, right? What I want you guys to know about what we're doing in this class is that we're not actually collecting or running data. And that's going to be a little bit different than probably some of the traditional research papers that you might have done in the past. Many reasons why we don't do that in this class. One, there's too many of y'all for me to sort of guide those projects, through that whole process. Two, we don't really have time for you all to be IRB certified and all that kind of stuff. And three, essentially, we want these to actually translate to the real world. So we want you guys to actually have an instrument at the end that you could implement in your own jobs, right? So there's no reason for us to test it here or to run that data here when the people who we would have actually doing the surveys aren't in the field. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of reasons why we don't actually collect the data here, but we're going to set this up and we're going to build out those methods and talk about those methods as if we were going to collect that data. So under this part 3, describe the method you're going to use to answer the proposed research questions, including rationale for its use and strengths and weaknesses. So essentially, depending on the topic that you're looking at, depending on the research that you do on the secondary level related to theories and models, depending on the audience that you're looking at, whether they're industry professionals or C-suite level people, it just really depends on the audience. That's all going to determine the method that you use to potentially test what you're doing, right? So if you've ever taken any kind of research methods or looked at any kind of qualitative or quantitative research situation, there's a lot of different ways to do all of that. Things like surveys, focus groups, content analyses, one-on-one interviews, any sort of means of data collection, right? So as we meet one-on-one, we'll sort of work on a way to test what you're looking for in a way that's going to be the most effective, that could potentially get you the results that you were looking for your project. So not all of you will do a survey. Not all of you will do a content analysis or a focus group or interviews. Your method is really going to be dependent on, again, what you're looking for and who you want to actually test, or who you'd actually be looking for responses. So again, that's where our one-on-one meetings are beneficial, because we'll sort of figure all that out on an individual basis, and then we'll kind of talk about ways to actually build those things out. You'll notice in this sort of third point here, you're going to actually describe the design of your study, and you'll actually build out things like code books or interview guides or questionnaires. So for example, if you decide, or if we decide collectively that you're going to be doing a survey, you will actually build out that survey questionnaire and attach it in your paper. So you'll actually put those questions together. You will actually sort of put in your screening questions, all that kind of stuff, and actually build that into your paper as if you could launch that, right? If you were doing a focus group, for example, you would actually put in your focus group questions, and who sort of those audiences would be and why, and build those in as an appendix. For the example I was using earlier about the job postings, he actually built out those different ad treatments, those different job postings, as part of that survey, as part of that questionnaire, and actually put those in as an appendix as well. So we're doing this as if we could implement this whenever we needed to whatever audience we needed to, and then be ready to go. Right. So, and again, we'll all talk about that individually, but just know that you're actually going to build out whatever method you are using. Right. So we're not just going to talk about it. We're actually going to build out the instrument itself in a way that it could be implemented if needed. Right. We're just not implementing it here. We're not collecting that data here. Okay. And so those are those first three parts. And then again, you can see this later on, and we'll talk about it in our individual meetings. But the last part, the first part that you submit to me is these first three sections. So parts 1 through 3. That's what's due to me on February 23rd. And I know that sounds soon, but we'll talk about that in a second as well and why that is. But then after that, and once I give you feedback on that part, the final section that you write and you put together is actually just your implications and discussion. So since we're not collecting data, since we're not actually going to have data points to analyze, we're going to talk about expected outcomes, right? So having done all this research in these first two sections and having built out this actual instrument and discussed that method, what will we expect to find if we were to run that experiment, right? So if we were to actually implement that survey among this audience, what would we expect to find, right? What outcomes would we expect to find given the questions that we've put in that survey? What outcomes would we expect to find with those two different ad treatments? Which one would we assume would be more effective based off the research that we've already done? How would we expect those focus groups to respond, given the research that we've already done, right? Or, that kind of thing. It's expected outcomes because, again, we don't have any data sets to go off of. So just keep that in mind. And again, the whole point of this is tying it back into the industry itself. How could the results of this project that I'm putting together or that I've put together at that point actually impact the industry as a whole? How could we benefit this industry that I've spent these last few weeks researching? What benefit could the results of something like this have? How could we help fix or address that particular issue, right, based off the research that I've conducted here? And that's kind of what we're talking about in this last section. It's more of a wrap up to the whole thing. And again, limitations and recommendations for future research, just like you would put in a traditional research paper. Okay. But again, this part doesn't come until after you submit your initial proposal. All right. And that initial proposal is parts 1 through 3. Okay. Any questions on that? I know that was kind of a lot to talk about at one time. But I'll open it to questions right now before we move into anything else. And we'll just kind of see what happens. Got that glare. Okay. Anybody so far? I mean, it's pretty straightforward, and we'll get most of this out of the way in our individual meetings too. But kind of collectively, I just want to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page of how to get started. One thing that is important to note is that none of you should really be doing the same thing, right? I mean, there's no reason for any of y'all to be kind of researching the exact same points, the exact same industry, the exact same situation. And so I'll make sure that doesn't happen when I meet with you guys individually, but just know that we're all going to be doing very different things and they will manifest very differently. And the outcomes will be very different for all of you depending on the project itself. So just keep that in mind. Let's see, we have more chat. Hang on. Okay, cool. And so other things that I think are important to make note of, you guys have the schedule on Blackboard as well, that kind of gives you different dates. The dates for those sort of review sections are arbitrary, so just review those different modules and the different research methods and different theories when you can. Once you've figured out your potential topic, right, the thing that you might want to look into, that's when you and I will schedule sort of individual meetings, or when you can schedule meetings with me sort of one-on-one. And some of you have done that already. But again, I want you to have at least an idea of what you're thinking about looking into before we have those. I don't want us just sitting there sort of spitballing back and forth on our Zooms. I want to use that time wisely, right? So if you have an idea that you think you want to pursue, we can go ahead and talk about it in an individual meeting whenever you want to set that up. That's fine. That Calendly link on Blackboard should have my updated availability. And so if there's a time there, feel free to set up a meeting and I'll get on it. And then once we have that topic squared away, we'll start thinking about ways to integrate theory and integrate some different sort of academic resources to support that as well. Because one thing that industry research really does depend on is leveraging the academic stuff that's already been researched, right? So if we can build a case that already exists, or a research that already exists, that's going to make what you're doing even stronger, right? So we need to sort of build a strong theoretical premise for your project to show me that you actually learned some stuff in your classes, right? So just keep that in mind too. And again, I'll help you with that process too. I'm more of a media effects person, right? So I think along the lines of framing, cultivation, that kind of stuff. But some of these other sort of more PR focused theories or more ad-based theories, we can look into jointly and kind of figure out a plan from there too. So other things I wanted to point out, just kind of in those assignment instructions, the whole thing in terms of your written content should be about 20 to 25 pages total. All right. Now that doesn't include things like your appendices or your title page or your works cited or any of that. But in terms of written content for the whole piece, 20-ish pages. Okay. Which won't be very difficult because your lit review will take up a lot of that. And also discussions of your method should take up a lot of that as well. So if you have enough citations, if you have enough resources, that that page count will sort of write itself. And particularly if you're using any tables or anything like that, the page count will just sort of happen, right? That's a very sort of standard number of pages. Now, obviously you do need things like a title page and sort of a works cited at the end, obviously, and your appendices as well. So just keep that in mind. Along that same line, everything's in APA. So if you are unfamiliar with APA style, surely you've probably written something in your program that had APA citations before. But if not, the internet is a great resource for that. There are citation machines that will do that for you. I like the book just because I can skim through it and find exactly what I need, but I'm not telling you to go buy a publication manual. But just know that we're going to be focusing in APA style, particularly for your in-text citations and your works cited page. Just make sure that those are following the appropriate style. Tables and stuff get a little iffy. I don't really care so much about that, but your citations in particular, make sure that those are APA. What else? This class is pass fail. I'm sure you guys have already realized that at this point, but you're not getting a letter grade for this course. It's either did you do the thing that you were supposed to do or did you not? I haven't failed anybody in this class in the 4 times that I've taught it so far, but y'all can be the first. So just make sure I'm not telling you that you're going to be, and I wouldn't like for you to be, but just know that it's pass fail. I don't intend to fail any of you, and I'm going to walk you all through this process as we go. So there's no reason why you should fail at this point, but just know that you're not getting an actual grade. And the reason for the deadlines being the way they are. So your deadline for your proposal, which is those first 3 parts, is Friday, February 23rd. All right, so a month and some change out from today. And the reason for that is our spring break is early this year. It's like the 2nd week of March, or that first full week of March. And so getting me these on the 23rd will give me that week before spring break to read through them all and then get you guys feedback before we leave for spring break, because that will give you guys kind of a month after spring break to work on wrapping everything up, making any edits that I suggest, and sort of finishing up the paper, submitting that final thing. And that final is due on April 12th. All right, and that's on your course schedule. And again, the reason for that is I've got to be able to read through all these, and fill out paperwork for the grad school so you all can graduate before the deadline. So that's the reason for those kind of early deadlines. It's not super fast, but it is a little bit earlier than you might be thinking, for the course. So just make sure you're aware of those deadlines. But they are for a reason. They're not just arbitrary. So don't hate me. I think that's it for now. I know that some of you have already set up some meeting times with me for your first sort of individual meeting. So what I'm really going to encourage you all to do kind of end of this week is sort of start thinking, if you haven't, about your topic. Again, this should be related to what you're currently doing, or at least related to the industry that you're planning on pursuing after graduation. Okay. And again, the whole goal of this is putting something together that you could potentially implement in your jobs, right? To actually address that issue to some extent. So you can be as specific or as broad as possible related to your particular industry or organization. But just know that there's meant to be sort of practical, real world application to this to address those real issues. And again, the scope of what you do will be very dependent on the problem that we're looking at, and the scope of sort of how you address that is going to be very dependent on the issue at hand. So we'll walk through that together. We'll work on that together. But just know that everybody's doing something very different. What else? So think about your topics. Those of you that have set up meetings this week, we'll have those. If you haven't, go ahead and take some time these next, sort of 2 days, the end of this week, to sort of figure out what you're planning on doing, and try to set something up with me early next week to make sure that we can get started, and that we can build out a sound case for your projects. Because again, I don't really want to waste that much more time, since you really only do kind of have a month and some change to get that proposal together. And the proposal doesn't have to be perfect when you submit it by any means, but it does need to be as sort of comprehensive as possible. So for example, I mean, if you don't have your instruments developed for your method when you submit that proposal, that's fine. You'll have time to put those together before you submit your final piece. If you have them together, that's great. But if you don't, we can sort of work on that. So, and again, it's all going to be very dependent on how often we meet individually, sort of individual challenges and issues that we have. But we'll sort of figure that out case by case. We won't necessarily meet together as a class again, collectively. So just kind of know that it's going to be on you to set meetings up with me when you need to, or to interact with your classmates when you need to. We can meet as a class again. I don't have any set up on the schedule, but that's something that you guys want to do later on. I'm fine with that. But we'll sort of set that up later on. But mostly this is kind of a me and you hashing things out kind of thing. I have talked long enough. What questions do any of you guys have about these projects? And I will try to answer them. Again, most of it can come in our individual meetings, but if there's something you think that the whole class might have a question about now, we can try and answer that. Is anybody terrified of this project? You shouldn't be. Zohaib asked if this is teamwork individuals. This is individuals, so you're all working kind of on your own for this. And again, you may be doing something similar to each other, but there shouldn't really be any overlap in terms of the actual projects themselves. Anybody else? Oh, admit. So I'll post the examples. I've got them ready to post. They're in an announcement that I just need to sort of turn on. So I might do that this afternoon. And those are from not my fall section, but I think last spring's section of the class. So those examples are all very diverse and cover sort of a lot of different areas, and they are formatted very differently. So you'll see kind of some variety there in what you can do. But again, what you do is really dependent, on you. But I'll show you some examples. Sometimes I hate posting examples because you're just going to want to do what's already there. But use them as a model, not as the law, right? You can sort of be flexible in terms of how you interpret those examples. But I'll get this posted by the end of the week for sure.
Hey, Caleb, just really quick, I guess, how would you suggest, you are fresh out of ideas. Sorry, I'm at work and they are moving
You're
in
good.
a new vending machine.
Love that.
But if you are fresh out of ideas, where would you go for like a springboard to start the ball rolling, I guess?
So I think it really depends on, I would start with your interests, right? So, I mean, I know you are sort of in the sports area, right? And so I think that I would start with your interests and look at not necessarily even from like a PR or advertising perspective, look at issues in that industry as a whole, right? And I would start with that and sort of see if there's any aspect of those issues that are present that you could frame out from a communications perspective, right? So for example, I mean, this is a dumb example, but we're looking at sort of the controversy right now of having Taylor Swift at all these Kansas City Chiefs games, right? And sort of the publicity shift in terms of NFL viewership among women now because they're looking for her and not for the Chiefs, right? They don't necessarily care what happens with the Chiefs. They just want to see Taylor, right? But that is shifting the dynamic of viewership, at least temporarily, for those NFL games. And I would say it's broadening the reach of the NFL games, right? And there was another thing that came out just recently about sort of the streaming only games and how that's affecting viewership as well. So I would look at sort of pervasive issues and see what kind of perspective or framework you could build out from like a communications, PR, promotional perspective that you could build a case for related to those issues, right? And it's going to start with things that you're interested in and things that you are not necessarily passionate about, but things that you can look at for the next 12 weeks, right? And don't necessarily think about it from it's got to be strict PR or strict ad or strict marketing, whatever. Think about bigger issues and then sort of narrow it down into something that is tied to what we do or could be tied to what we do. And that would work for any industry. So if it's, um, automotive, right? I mean, they're trying really hard to unionize here in Alabama in particular. So how does the media affect that unionization struggle, right? What sort of coverage are we getting, and how does that put a PR kind of spin on the idea of unionizing in that automotive industry, right? What does the messaging look like? How does that pervade sort of the zeitgeist when we think about unionizing, right? Cosmetics, anything. There's a lot of different ways to approach um, these sort of larger issues from the perspective of what we do. Does that make sense? Did that help at all? Okay.
Yeah, it did. Thanks.
Okay. Cool. Anybody else? I mean, that was a good question. So if you're stuck, I mean, I would not focus so hard on, it's got to be this or it's got to be this. Let's start with what we're interested in and just something that we want to know more about. And then let's kind of look at ways to frame it out in terms of, promotional or messaging or something related or tied to what we do. If that makes any sense. So in advertising, for example, I mean, let's look at the audiences that we're reaching and sort of the spokespeople that we're using and sort of controversies behind particular brand endorsements or influencers. All of that. You can really build a case for anything as long as you can justify to me that there is a tie back into what you do, what you want to do, or the industry as a whole. So I'm really kind of open to that. Any good sources for academic theories for literature reviews? Cases can be internal comm issues. So I would say that I would go back to some of your original coursework. Again, those courses like 550 and 551, where you're sort of building those that foundational stuff, whether it's theories, models, industry information, whatever. And also looking at the resources in our course modules. There's a really good review of theory and research methods in those course modules as well. So they're going to come from, I think, Dr. Hayes, who teaches maybe analysis and insights. I'm not sure. But there's some good theoretical information there. And it's just worth kind of looking into a general search of public relations or communication theories. And I will help you sort of build out your theoretical framework once I know what your issue is, because again, depending on what that is going to dictate, how we proceed and how we sort of build that case. So messaging or audiences or whatever. There's a lot of different ways to build out those cases. So don't worry so much about the theory part right now. Worry about getting a solid idea started, and we can build that out case by case. That's a good question. Anybody else? So again, I mean, don't think about it as something that should be stressful. I mean, it's a pretty intensive project, and it's a pretty sort of strict deadline, pretty quick deadline. But work on something that you're interested in. Work on something that is happening around you, or that you're seeing, because again, these are supposed to be real world things that we're looking at solving, right? And then I will sort of individually help you build out the case for the project itself, but you kind of have to be the ones that figure out the direction for the projects themselves. So just keep that in mind. But it needs to be something that you're interested in, because again, you're looking at it for the next sort of 10 weeks or so. So don't get burned out on it in these first few weeks. And then that's easy to do. But like I said, if you come up with an idea, or you think you have an idea that you want to sort of talk with me about and sort of hash out with me, feel free to set up those one-on-one meetings. You can set those up as often or as infrequently as you want. I'm not going to tell you how many times you need to set those up with me. I would like to speak with all of you at least once in these sort of preliminary stages to make sure that you're on the right track to get started, and that we have a good solid idea. But after that, it's really kind of as needed with me. So use that Calendly link. I'll update my availability this afternoon to make sure that all that's squared away and up to date for as far as I know for the semester. But if anything comes up, before then, or if you have any questions about anything, feel free to email me as well. But we really will hash out most of this kind of in our one-on-ones with each other. So set those up when needed, and I will try and work out whatever questions you have at that point. All right. Anybody else have anything before we sort of turn off for the day? All right. Well, I'm excited. I enjoy teaching this class. This is, again, wrapping you guys up to finish up. So show me that you have learned something. Show me that you can sort of synthesize original research. And let's put together some really interesting projects. I will say I'm actually submitting a paper from the fall to a conference for this summer. So hopefully, if any of these are any good, and I'm sure they will be, we can actually look at some conference presentations and that kind of thing too. So just keep that in mind as you work through these projects. There is some potential to sort of send them further down the line. All right. Well, if nothing else, I will sort of wrap this up for the day. But again, work on finding your topics, set up meetings with me as needed, at least once in the next week or so. Let's kind of try and get together individually, and we will kind of go from there. All right. All right, guys. Anything comes up, let me know. And other than that, I will talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Have a good one, guys.
Bye.
See ya. Bye.